Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog. I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and welcome to Contemporary Science. Tonight we have Mick Follows from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Follows received his PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of East Anglia in the UK in 1991. He then spent a year as a Royal Society postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry in Germany before joining the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's now a senior research scientist at the MIT program for atmospheres, oceans, and climates. He's also the co-author of a new text, Ocean Dynamics and the Carbon Cycle. Dr. Follows' research is focused on the very complex interconnections between the physical, chemical, and biological processes that determine the distribution of elements in the ocean and the relationship between ocean ecosystems and their environment. This system requires expertise in multiple fields: mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology, among other things. Understanding this global system is very important for science generally because it drives the planet. It's especially important in our time when there's so much climate and ecosystem change taking place. Tonight, Dr. Follows will explain one of the most important systems that sustains life on our planet, the global ocean carbon cycle. We'll find out what that is and why the ocean carbon cycle is both a fascinating and urgent area of study. We'll also learn how technology and computer modeling are used to penetrate the complexities of the carbon global cycle. It's a very special pleasure to welcome Dr. Follows. Welcome, Dr. Follows. Okay. Tonight we're going to talk about this very complex, convergent kind of field. And so I'd like to ask, just for starters, what is biogeochemistry?
It's a kind of a buzzword. I don't know when it quite was coined, but as you say, we're working in a field of science where we're thinking about organization of elemental cycles in the ocean, and that includes geophysical processes, maybe geological processes, geophysical processes being transport by ocean currents, for example, biological processes, the formation of new organic material from inorganic components, and ecological processes related to that. And of course, chemical processes, the transformations of carbon and carbonates and other compounds in the ocean or in other environments. And so biogeochemistry is a kind of convenient way to say it's this complex system that involves physical, chemical, and biological earth sciences, I guess you could say.
Right, because I guess it's just one huge system. So we hear now system sciences too, and this is one of them. So we have this gigantic sort of field, and then we hear a lot about the carbon cycle, but I don't think that as a non-specialist that we understand it all that well. There are lots of cycles, but can you tell us what the carbon cycle is and then why it's so important?
Okay. So carbon's a very abundant element on the planet, and it's in all the different reservoirs. You could think of each reservoir, the rocks, the geological reservoir. There's carbon trapped or tied up in rocks. There's carbon tied up in trees and in litter in soils. So there's what we call a terrestrial reservoir of carbon. There's carbon in both inorganic and organic forms in the ocean, but there's a lot of dissolved carbonate in the ocean, so a lot of a huge amount of carbon in the ocean relative to what's in the atmosphere. And finally, there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which we care about a lot because it's a greenhouse gas. It has an impact on climate, and it in turn is impacted on by climate. And so we can think of those reservoirs being all connected. And so I think the carbon cycle, the global carbon cycle, is really the partitioning of carbon, the element carbon, between those four major reservoirs, and the fluxes between them. So depending on the temperature and other conditions of the ocean, carbon dioxide may dissolve in the ocean, so there's a flux of carbon from the atmosphere into the ocean, and so on and so forth. And so the balance between all those different fluxes between the reservoirs and the partition of carbon between them is what I would think of as the global carbon cycle.
And so there's a land version and there's an ocean version, which I guess they sort of all go together.
Right.
But you concentrate on the ocean. Why is the ocean so important?
So there's about 50 or 60 times more carbon dissolved in the ocean than is present in the atmosphere as CO2. There's actually a lot more than that in the rocks, but the carbon in the rocks is kind of tied up on long time scales. It takes hundreds of thousands or millions of years for the atmosphere and the rocks to kind of interact in a way that will dramatically change the atmosphere, for example. But the ocean and atmosphere communicate rather quickly. So you could think of the ocean as the ocean carbon reservoir is a bath full of water, and the atmosphere is a little cup next to it, and it's got much less ability to hold water. And so a little spill over the edge of the bath will hardly change what's in the bath, but it will fill the cup very quickly. And so we think that the ocean can affect the atmosphere rather quickly because they communicate well, but it's a huge reservoir, so a little change in the ocean can make a big change in the atmosphere. And so we think this has happened in the past, in glacial periods. Carbon has perhaps been taken out of the atmosphere and sequestered in the oceans, and could be the other way in different climates. And so there's a lot of focus on how the ocean carbon cycle is working, how is it changing, because changes in it might affect the atmosphere quite quickly and significantly. If we're thinking about the anthropogenic, the man-made emissions or fossil fuel burning, putting CO2 into the atmosphere, that builds up a pressure of CO2 in the atmosphere that will ultimately drive carbon dioxide across the surface into the ocean, so it will dissolve in the ocean. That does impact the chemistry of the oceans, and so the ability of the ocean to keep taking up carbon dioxide will change as it's already accumulating dissolved CO2. And it will also potentially impact organisms in the ocean. One important part of the ocean carbon cycle that we'll talk about later, I think, is what we call the biological pump of carbon. And so in the surface ocean, where there's plenty of light, if nutrient-rich waters get to the surface ocean, then we can have photosynthesis. So dissolved carbon dioxide can be taken up by organisms, turned into organic material, and by phytoplankton, tiny plants. Those plants get eaten by other organisms that eventually die or poop, and organic detritus sinks back into the deeper ocean. And that leads to a net transfer of carbon from the surface ocean down into the deep ocean. It reduces the pressure of carbon in the surface ocean and allows more carbon from the atmosphere to be driven into the ocean. So this so-called biological pump, part of the ocean carbon cycle, moves carbon basically down from the atmosphere into the deep ocean, reducing atmospheric CO2, which is we kind of like that nowadays, because we always worried there might be too much. And so if the ocean becomes more acidic because of the dissolving of fossil fuel CO2, it's possible that that might alter the kinds of organisms and the efficiency of growth of organisms, and therefore the efficiency of this biological storage. And so there's a possibility that increased atmospheric CO2 will acidify the ocean. We know it will acidify the ocean, and that acidification could potentially affect the ability of the ocean to store CO2. And so it could have some kind of feedback. I think it's still an open question about the nature of that feedback. That's something we're trying to understand right now.
So that's what you spend a lot of time on, I guess, you know, at this time then.
Yeah.
Well, then, while we're on that, is there, in your view, is there a substantial factor for what we are putting into the atmosphere that is causing this? That's legitimate to be worried about that now?
There's sort of multiple levels to that question. There's the big question, you probably talked about it before, I'm sure, about how CO2 is impacting the climate and may warm the oceans and so forth. That's one particular issue. Another one that's very sort of current is that one thing is certain: the more CO2 that's in the atmosphere, the more dissolves in the ocean, and the more acidic the oceans become. And that's something that we know is happening, and it's happening quite rapidly. Now, it has happened in the past. There have been periods in Earth history, you know, millions of years ago, maybe, but when the oceans may have been as acidic as they're heading towards now, but typically that took a long time to reach that state. And we're making this change happen in decades rather than thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And so we're kind of in unexplored territory about how significantly that will affect the system. We know that given long time scales, ocean organisms may simply evolve and adapt to new conditions, but on what time scale does that happen? So there are some interesting questions that tie in evolution, you know, all to the ocean chemistry and things.
Because it's unprecedented.
But it's really the time scale of this change is what's so different, I think, than previous, than the Earth has seen.
We just want to get that clarified, that there are these cycles in the past, and there are these other factors, the tilt, you know, the Earth, and all of these kinds of things. But that, as you mention in the book, it's very well established that it's beyond just these cycles. You need to talk about these other kinds of factors, the human factor in this now. Can I switch to plankton?
Yes.
Okay, because I don't know that it's intuitive for most of us that when we talk about this carbon cycle, that these little creatures that the whales love to eat, right? That these creatures are so vitally important for ecosystems generally. Could you tell us what these characters are? And I know you have some pictures of them for us later and everything, but what are they? Why are they important?
So they're the plants of the ocean, if you like. They're like the grass of the ocean, except they're tiny unicellular organisms. They range in size from a micron, a thousandth of a millimeter in diameter, to, you know, approaching a millimeter in diameter. They sometimes live in colonies, and so they might be somewhat larger than that. The phytoplankton I'm talking about, they are phototrophs, which means that they live by harvesting energy from light. So they have chlorophyll, just in the same way as the terrestrial plants do. They harvest energy from light and use that energy to convert inorganic carbon, dissolved CO2, and other nutrient elements into organic molecules, essentially to reproduce themselves. They just want to make a copy of themselves, right? So as we talked about briefly earlier, all of this happens in the surface ocean. It's light. If you depend on light for your energy source, then you can only live in the top few meters, maybe 100 meters of the ocean. And in that region, they're converting inorganic carbon, CO2, into organic molecules which help them reproduce. When they reproduce, they're a food source for larger organisms, ultimately for fish, and those organisms are food for us, whales, whatever, you know, and they have this role in the carbon cycle of the ocean, because that primary production, we call it, ultimately leads to the sinking organic material, which lowers atmospheric CO2.
Okay, so we had better appreciate these little guys.
Oh yeah, they're very cool.
Okay.
If we didn't have them growing in the ocean, the atmospheric CO2 would probably be at least twice what it is now already. Just in terms of a direct effect, they certainly contribute to the maintenance of oxygen in the atmosphere, and so.
So that's a fairly important.
They're very small and they live for a very short time as individuals, but they're very important on a global scale.
Right, and you can see them, as you're going to show us later, from a distance. Well, you can't see individuals, but they show up, and they're really significant for the carbon cycle and for the health of the planet in general, apparently. Okay, now I'd just like to also clarify something about the models that you all work with, and to give people a sense of how you sort of figure things out. Can you tell us about how you do these models a little bit? And
well, I'll talk about modeling. I'll try and illustrate that with some slides later, but I guess I should clarify, you know, if we're trying to study the plankton in the ocean, how they relate to their environment, there are many ways to go about that, and many people are going out to sea and making measurements of their distributions at sea, and what they're looking at what they're doing at sea. Others are bringing them back to the lab and asking, you know, under what conditions do they grow best. My group, we tend to work at the kind of theoretical end of things, and so we're trying to take those kinds of information and use mathematical models or computer simulations to try and mimic what's going on in nature, but in a kind of code that we can interpret, and then use those models to understand how the system works. And so you can end up with a rather complex system, and sometimes by writing it down in a clean mathematical form, you can kind of turn it into something that's a little bit easier to get your head around if you kind of understand that language. And by using computer simulations, we can try and think about understanding how the system might change, have changed in the past or in the future, in much the same way that a weather forecast works. They use computer simulations of the atmosphere, and I'll try and illustrate that.
Yes, I wanted to get, since we have high school students in our audience, that this modeling is really essential today in many fields, but certainly in this one, and that it is used a lot for predicting. But Dr. Follows has written on how to develop really good models, because you could have models that are not so effective out there, but you've put a lot of effort into thinking of really good models, and I realize it's a challenge to work these things out.
We probably all think we have the best models,
course,
right?
all right.
But we
don't be modest. That's quite all right. Yes.
You know, it's fun to try and do things a different way sometimes.
Exactly, but it just seems as though you hear models in all fields today, and it's become a really important thing. Okay, I'd like to talk about your book just very briefly, and then the Darwin Project just briefly, and then we'll talk about gorgeous animations and things that you have for us. You and your colleague in England have written this wonderful book, and there's something in particular I'd like to be sure that we say about it. Would you like to tell us about the first two chapters?
Right, yeah, so my friend Rick and I decided that we'd accumulated various bits of understanding, and we'd like to put them down in a book. We thought that our experience might be useful, but we also thought it'd be really a shame if we only spoke to our peers, and that we'd like our families and our friends to be able to at least read the first few pages of the book and get something about what we work on out of that. And so the first 2 chapters are written first as a motivation. Why are the oceans important in the climate system? Why do we care about these biological and chemical aspects of the ocean? And then a second chapter is kind of an overview, an executive summary of the book, I guess, written without any mathematics, hopefully in plain language. And so the aim was to try and have the first 2 chapters be useful for a much wider audience than the rest of the book, which gets rather technical, which is more aimed at our graduate students, for example.
But I'd like to say that it's a wonderful book. I've looked at the whole thing, you know, but I was very impressed that the authors would take the trouble, and it's a lot of trouble, to write for non-experts or people who are not planning to necessarily go into this field, and it just should be on library shelves. So I was going to ask the public library to please order this book, because it's indispensable in a lot of ways to get your head around a complex subject. It's very well done. So I just wanted to say that. And it was a very nice book. And then our final question here before we go on is about the Darwin Project. So this is not the rediscovery of evolution or anything like that, but you have to work in teams in fields like this. So could you tell us about that briefly, and then we'll use that to go to your slides.
Right. I think, as you said, it's a complex subject, and we all come from different disciplinary backgrounds, and we have to specialize somewhat. But at the same time, in a topic like this, we need to overarch those disciplinary boundaries. And so, you know, to some extent we can try and re-educate ourselves a little bit, but I think the important thing is to be able to develop lines of communication with the experts in the other pieces of the problem. And
what kind of experts what kinds of experts are involved?
So in the Darwin Project, for example, this was a case where people like myself who had thought about the physics and chemistry of the ocean quite a lot and were interested in how that related to the biology, but were not biologists, wanted to bring our area of expertise towards more ecological problems, and to do that we had to collaborate with people from ecology and biology, and they were interested at the same time to move towards blending their expertise and ours. And so the Darwin Project was a project centered around using models and theory to try and understand how plankton communities are organized in the ocean, how the rates of growth of plankton populations and the organization of different species of plankton in different environments worked by bringing together those people from those different disciplines. And so we found a group of people who were like-minded in that way and had found ways to communicate with each other. Our biologist colleagues are very patient with us and corrected us many times as we abused their technical terms frequently.
I see.
And so it's a project that's focused on using models and theory to understand the ecology and carbon cycle of the oceans.
I see.
Bringing together these different people.
Is it just MIT people, or is it beyond the MIT?
It's really an MIT-based project, but we have lots of connections. You know, always you find people around the world who you enjoy communicating with, or bring something different that you'd like to pull in. So we have nice collaborations with
I see.
some colleagues around the world.
Right. Well, before you go on to to the slides, I'll just say that there's a link to the Darwin Project. It's quite something to see this. There's a link on our page for Dr. Follows, and you can have a look at the Darwin Project and some of these other things that are going on. And now let me turn this over to you so that you can trot through these through the wonderful slides that you're going to talk to us about.
Well, thank you. I thought what I would do is try and give a flavour of what does this mean? What are models? What are ocean models, and how do we build them? How do we use them? And a little bit of the history of that. And I tried to put a few animations and slides together to illustrate that. I hope this is clears the air a bit. It always seems a little bit mysterious, I think, when you're not involved in it. And so we talked about the ocean carbon cycle and plankton. So this first image just shows a couple of things. On the left-hand side are some images of individual phytoplankton cells, and so the scale bar at the top is 20 microns. So 1 micron is a thousandth of a millimeter. So you can see, first of all, these tiny organisms. There's a diversity of species, or what we call functional groups. So there are many, many thousands of species which all look or behave differently in the ocean. One thing they all have in common is that they all use chlorophyll and other pigments to harvest light and perform photosynthesis. And you can see the large cell in the lower left is a diatom, and that beautiful sort of honeycomb structure is made out of silicon, mineral silicon, and the little green blobs are chloroplasts. That's where its pigments, its chlorophyll are, where it harvests light. The map on the top right is an image from space that's been manipulated a little bit. Just as you can see a forest of trees in the distance, and you can't see the individual trees or leaves, but you can see green, and you know there's a forest there. So too, when we look at the ocean from space, the greenness of the water tells us how much plankton is there, how much phytoplankton is present, how much chlorophyll. And this is an image from a NASA satellite that has been, the colours have been tweaked. It's not really that bright, but where it's green or yellow or even orange is where the chlorophyll concentration in the surface of the ocean is very high. And so you can see some features like the higher latitude oceans, the subpolar oceans are very rich in chlorophyll. There's a great supply of nutrients from below there, whereas the subtropics have very little chlorophyll in the surface. And that's because the supply of nutrients is very weak there. We can see an animation of that. So NASA's had these satellites flying for about since the late 80s. We now have beautiful animations of these images of the distribution of chlorophyll in the surface ocean from space. And so we're just stepping through several years worth of these data. It's patchy. You can only see the ocean when it's not cloudy. So they're often, when you see black there, it's just we couldn't get enough data. But you can see again these regional patterns with intense chlorophyll concentrations in the subpolar regions and low chlorophyll concentrations in the subtropics. And you can see that the higher latitudes are very seasonal. There are strong spring blooms. In the North Atlantic it's just blooming now. You can see intense oranges and reds as the spring, the ocean warms up, and there's plenty of nutrients there, and the plankton are suddenly happy and bloom, start reproducing like crazy, and then they're eaten by bigger organisms. And so to sort of switch to modelling, so this is a beautiful data set and a view of the oceans nowadays that relies on very modern technology. So back in the 1940s, people knew about these, just make sure this is playing. Back in the 1940s, people knew about these spring blooms in the North Atlantic, for example, but they didn't have these beautiful satellite technologies, but they were going out to sea in boats and taking samples and making direct measurements. And there's a very famous time series of measurements made at George's Bank, which is just off the coast of Massachusetts. I think you probably recognize Cape Cod there, and that kind of orange and red spot just off the coast of Massachusetts is George's Bank. Is a bump in the seafloor that brings nutrients to the surface and fuels the growth of phytoplankton, and we know that supports populations up to whales. In the 1940s, a man called Gordon Riley, who was at Yale at the time, and his colleagues at Woods Hole were aware of this spring bloom in that system, and they took several cruises over the course of a few years in different seasons and measured the chlorophyll, the abundance of phytoplankton, and the temperature and all the attendant environmental data in that region. And so their view of the phytoplankton abundance at George's Bank was from a single point in space, and each blue dot on this graph represents the measurement of the abundance of phytoplankton at a different time in the year. So the x-axis is month here, and what you can see is there's a low background concentration of chlorophyll or phytoplankton, and then a big peak in the spring when this spring bloom happens. And Gordon Riley was a pioneer in modeling plankton populations. So we still today use ideas that Gordon Riley first really brought to the table. And he was looking at how his physical oceanography colleagues were thinking about temperature changes and other physical changes and using mathematical models to try and predict them or interpret them. And he decided to do the same thing. And so just a little tiny bit of mathematics. It doesn't matter if you're comfortable with the mathematics, it's a differential equation. But he wrote down an equation and he said the rate of change in the abundance of phytoplankton, that left-hand side, dB over dt, that rate of change is given by the balance between the growth of the population, the division of the cells, and the losses due to respiration, which uses up their body mass in just providing bodily functions, and also grazing, predation by other organisms. And he just said we can write down a simple equation like this, and if we know how growth and loss terms depend upon the environment that the organisms are in, we can solve this equation as a function of time and predict what the system will look like. So it's just a very simple balance. If you know that there's more reproduction going on than predation, then the whole population is growing. If it's the opposite, then the population's dying. So it's really interesting. There were no computers then, so Gordon Riley sat down with a pencil and paper, and it took him a week to calculate a year's worth of solution, right? So it's no trivial task, and most of us wouldn't have the patience to do that now. And he was able to come up with this, the solid line, which is theoretical prediction, which, if you're involved in this kind of thing, I think you would know that that's a pretty good model. That's a nice simulation. And he didn't get the chance to tweak it a lot because it was very labor intensive. And so he kind of showed us the way to use mathematical models to predict how phytoplankton populations might change. And the models we use today are a lot more elaborate and complex and demanding, but the fundamental philosophy of them and the fundamental way we write them down is pretty much the same as Gordon Riley. And so I want to think about how over the last 70 years or so, one major thing that's happened, we now have much more elaborate descriptions of the ocean. And so instead of modeling the plankton populations, trying to simulate what's happening to the plankton just at one point in space, we can try and do it over the whole globe. And to do that, we divide the globe up into tiny chunks, maybe a few kilometers across or maybe hundreds of kilometers across. And so this image shows us a virtual bit of the North Atlantic. That's virtual Cape Cod from our computer model. There's the, Provincetown sticking out on the end there. And each little square is a chunk of the ocean, and we've assigned the dot in the middle. We assign a set of equations like those that Gordon Riley wrote down to calculate what's happening at that place in the ocean. But we can do it all simultaneously. So it took him a week to calculate the plankton changes over a year at one point on this graph. Now we can use a computer to calculate it for many thousands of points over the whole ocean simultaneously in a second or two, and then project it forward for centuries if we want. And so we're not doing anything more mentally sophisticated, but we have a lot of brute force power to bring to the problem. And so I'll just animate this. This is actually showing the simulation. It's a model of sea surface temperature, the temperature of the surface ocean. So we can do a similar exercise for temperature, for nutrients, for momentum and currents. And so as we step back, the grid is kind of blending in, and we can see we can make that grid span the whole Earth, and this is a simulation of the temperature of the oceans and in a global sense. And so this is kind of like the ocean equivalent of a weather forecast model. When you look at a prediction of tomorrow's temperature in the atmosphere around us, they're using exactly this kind of technology, but it's employed in the atmosphere. And so you can think about these ocean models as the analogues of the tools that weather forecasters are trying to use to tell what the weather's going to be like next week. As well as temperature, those models will predict or tell us something about the speed of the currents in the ocean. And so I'm not sure if you can see this very well, but the white areas are where the speeds are fastest, and you can see currents like the Gulf Stream on the east coast of the US moving swiftly northwards, and all sorts of interesting and rich features. And so again, it's like a weather forecast model that's telling you about the winds in the atmosphere. This is telling us about the currents in the ocean and how that's moving properties in the ocean like plankton, like carbon, around in the ocean, so we can simulate that. It's a bit like a big video game sim world, right? It's kind of, if you want to look at it in those terms. So we can add plankton into that model, and this is what my group's done. So the physical models I've been showing you were made by our colleagues at MIT, and my group adds phytoplankton into that system. And so basically we're solving a set of equations like Riley's equations, all of these thousands of grid points around the globe, and we're telling those virtual plankton about their environment because from the physical model, from the ocean model. And so this is our simulation of the chlorophyll from space that we saw earlier. And we can start to use these models as ways to interpret what's going on in the observed world. And so just for a comparison, on the top now you can see the animated observations from space, and on the bottom is our prediction from a simulation. So it's a bit like comparing the actual weather that happened yesterday with the prediction from the weather forecast model. And so again, as you well know from the weather forecast, we don't get it right all the time in every place. And so we can start to make quantitative comparisons, careful comparisons, and where the model matches the observations quite well, we can then interrogate the model system. We can ask any question of it because we've generated all those numbers. We know all the values of the fluxes and the concentrations of everything, and we can start to use simpler theories to boil it down to its essence. So this is one use of models, is to try and first simulate and then interpret complex systems where there's a combination of all these different influences. One of the things that we've been doing in the Darwin Project particularly is to come back to this idea that that chlorophyll signature that you see from space, those images of the abundance of plankton, actually reflect a very diverse community. And there are different kinds of plankton living in different regions or dominating in different regions, just in the same way as you have palm trees in the tropics on land, but maybe pine trees as you move into high latitudes where it's cooler or more seasonal. So too in the oceans there are different types of plankton living in different regimes, and our colleagues are out finding ways to observe those patterns. People are trying to interpret those patterns from space now. Again, we're trying to get more information from satellites, and we can introduce that concept into our ocean model. And so now here the colours represent the abundance not of the total phytoplankton community, but of different species within that community, or different groups of species. And so again, there's this analogy with palm trees in the tropics. We have these a green coloured population that like to live in the nutrient-starved tropics or are well adapted to that, whereas the red colour guys are more adapted to very turbulent conditions, seasonal conditions, places where there are intermittently very high nutrient concentrations. And so our current work is very much focused on understanding why different phytoplankton live in different places, how they relate to their environment, and what will happen if that environment shifts. Say the globe, say the planet warms, we think it's likely that the subtropical regions will expand in extent. So maybe the green organisms will expand their domain. They'll become more dominant in a larger region of the global environment. And so these are the kind of questions we can explore in this model world. We can do all sorts of experiments like that and ask, how does this system reorganize if it changes?
And also, I guess, play with some of the factors that are that you're trying to figure out how they change the balance of the whole system.
That's right, and it's a complex system, so a change to one thing in the system, it's not always immediately obvious what that will do to the rest of the system, and sometimes our intuition isn't right either. And this is a sort of alternative way to frame that a bit more formally and explore those kind of questions.
Right. That's really interesting that it can do that. Yeah.
So that's kind of what I wanted to say about our efforts, and a little bit of potted history of modelling the oceans. This is my favourite movie. Oliver, our visual guy in the group, loves to make these, so I thought I'd just show this. This is just really beautiful. I hope people were able also to see there's a little, like a calendar, it goes, the months down on the bottom and stuff. I hope it showed up all right and stuff. But in any case, that was wonderful. And Dr. Follows, thank you very much. And then we'll shift to let people ask questions here too, if you would like to. And so thank you, first of all. Thank you very much. And we'll open it for questions. We couldn't cover everything, so we hope that if you have some questions, hang around.
The cover on the book,
okay,
it must mean something.
Yes.
It's hard. It looks like gases that are mixing.
Yes, that's actually it's a still picture from one of these animations. It's the, if I could just reach it across this is the US, the east coast of the US, and this South America, and the colours, the white colours indicate the speed of the currents. So this is the current in our simulation. So this is the Gulf Stream wending its way up the beside the east coast. You can see these eddies shed off. There sometimes are these big standing eddies in the Gulf of Mexico. The green colours here indicate the simulation of the chlorophyll, and so you're right. It's not gases, but it's liquid. But you're seeing the swirling interactions of this fluid environment. And I think one thing we see nicely in the model is just how dynamic it is and how rich it is on all scales with these eddies and things, and it's really kind of nice as a bit of abstract kind of pattern as well.
You can have a look at the book. It's full of fantastic graphics and stuff. I think we'll have to stop, but you can hang around, ask questions, or if the students have to go or something. But if you'd like to hang around, ask questions, it will be fine. But they're going to cut us off because we have a time thing. So I do apologize for that. But in any case, you're free to talk with him, and I will stop here so that because they're going to cut us off anyway. So,
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
But please hang around and ask questions. If you talk to him, if you would like to, by all means. Thank you so much.
Thank
that
you.
was very interesting.
I was an undergraduate in physics, and I went into atmospheric sciences after that, and that led me to a postdoc at MIT, where I was working on atmospheric problems, but mostly surrounded by oceanographers, and I got working with them. And there are lots of parallels, so it's not a hard transition to make there. And then over the course of a decade or so, I got more and more interested in the biological aspects of oceanography. And so I kind of slid gently from physics into more biological oceanography. And I was able to follow my nose and my interests, really. I just found myself fascinated by a particular aspect of the problem, so I was quite happy to go and read a very basic text on some aspects of biology and try and learn things along the way. And so I guess you could say it was difficult. I had to dive into something I hadn't thought about very much over the years, but on the other hand, that was the fun piece of it. Felt like I was still learning something new. I think certainly as an undergraduate, it's great to dive into a discipline, and the one that excites you most at the time, and follow that. Do what makes you excited, what makes you interested, and just be prepared for the fact that might change over the years. You can change too if you want.
You can catch up.
But I think it's perhaps not wise to try and be too diverse too soon. You could trip up. So it's good to find something you really like and follow that. So I work with graduate students, as you said. They come and join our program, and they're interested in oceans, climate, system, and often coming from many different disciplinary backgrounds, physics, chemistry, or biology. They're not necessarily completely sure of everything that's going on in oceanography, so they'll start the program by taking some classes, and they get a broad view of the system, and they're able to get a broad vision, and then we'll work together on their research, developing their research skills and their research questions, and then after a couple of years they define their own research project. I think when we're taking new graduate students, we don't care if they've had any oceanography or not. They should be interested, or climate science, whatever. They should be interested in that. If they've got a strong disciplinary background from chemistry, physics, biology, math, or some combination of that, then we think they'll have a solid foundation of thinking about problems and how to tackle them. And so, and then oftentimes people nowadays are very interested in cross-cutting questions, and so they have a chance to be introduced to those bits and pieces of the other elements of the problem as they begin graduate school. It's a good thing if you enjoy learning, right? Because you'll be doing a lot of it.
Right.
It's good to be self-motivated, to allow yourself to be driven by your own questions. So I think science is a bit like doing puzzles, right? And even if somebody else or thousands of people have discovered something before you, when you first understand a new thing or some problem that seemed mysterious to you, when you first kind of crack it, you kind of, it's a rush and you feel excited, and you don't care if the whole rest of the world knew it. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, nobody else did know it, right? And so I feel like there's that kind of rush that you get, that kind of little tickle of pleasure that you would get when you realise you've just managed to crack the back of a hard puzzle or crossword or something, but sort of magnified.
Yes.
And that often happens in conjunction with colleagues. You're talking about things at the blackboard and scribbling diagrams and equations down and solving it together. That's always fun. Those things are really great fun.
Right.
So for me, I think, it's there's a lot of different kind of groupings in science. You could be in a very big project, the Collider project, and in some sense, it's a very top-down, large project that has to be controlled. I think it's a little bit personality. Personally, I would hate to be in charge of something big like that. Yeah, I feel for me it's much more organic, and I like to make connections with people who turns out for whatever reason we're like-minded, and so I like kind of small group science, and I wouldn't be good at leading a big group science, I know that, but other people feel quite differently. So I guess it's, like in every other walk of life, different people are going to function better, and but if you're really solitary and you like working out equations on a bit of paper, you can find that you can do that successfully too. There's something for everybody.
Yes,
if you want to be a big manager of a big project, you can find a way to do that too. Yeah, there's always things that feel like a heavy weight at the time. One of the things we do as research scientists is support ourselves and our groups by raising funds, and it's good, it keeps you sharp. You have to justify the things you want to do, but when it's late Sunday night and you're trying to finish a proposal that needs to be sent off to NSF tomorrow, and you wish you were doing something else, those moments can be a bit kind of less fun. But they come and go, and it's pretty easy life, really, relative to what many other people have to do.